Here's a point that has to be made. The entire epistemological future of the internet is really in the balance. We have to resist the impulse to be, either complete techno-optimists or complete Luddites.
When our post-everything world has turned life upside down, how do you even know which end is up?
If you're committed to a community or a cause greater than yourself, you don't have the luxury of checking out or the freedom to burn out.
It's not enough to just keep surviving. We need to thrive again.
This is Post Everything,
a podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age.
Welcome to Post Everything. My name is John Homus, and I'm here with my co-host, Brad Edwards. And today we are interviewing Mike Graham, who is the program director at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics with the Gospel Coalition. Now, you might remember Mike came on a few seasons ago to talk about his book with Jim Davis, The Great Dechurching. And Mike is really great at research. And currently, he is researching and writing on artificial intelligence. In fact, the Gospel Coalition just released a report evaluating 7 top LLMs for theological reliability. But the Gospel Coalition and Mike wanted to do some research and analysis on how large language models interacted with the Christian faith. So let's get into the interview now. Brad and I are on with Mike Graham, Program Director at the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. Mike, welcome to Post Everything.
Good to be here. Thank you, John.
Let's ask some level-setting questions about the report on artificial intelligence. What made you think that this was something you wanted to give time to? Why did you embark on this endeavor in the first place? What was the problem you were seeing?
Yeah, so before Tim Keller passed, my boss, Colin Hansen, had a lot of conversations with him about some areas of focus in the first couple of years of the center. And so one of those areas of focus was definitely artificial intelligence. So if you recall, in November of 2022, GPT-3 launched. That was a watershed moment for anybody who is in like the tech world. That wasn't a story that kind of crossed over, I think, into the mainstream conversation. I'll cover that in a second. But it was for anybody who is kind of, tech or tech adjacent. And so, so GPT-3 launched about 6 months or so before Tim passed. And so that was a feature of, kind of those early conversations right before we had launched the Keller Center 3 months later in February of 2023. And so we had done a lot of publishing actually at the center on AI in 2023 and 2024. And even at our very first retreat, I met with Alan Noble and Keith Plummer. We were the AI subcommittee, for the center. And it wasn't easy kind of coming up with ideas for publication for this because people, when we published on this in 23 and 24, nobody read it. I mean, like in terms of like how articles perform on the TGC website, I mean, these articles were bad in terms of like readership. It's just, there just wasn't appetite there. But everything has changed in 2025. That story that was largely just kind of like a niche, esoteric, kind of tech-only world has really crossed over into broader culture and society on every level. I go to sports. It's like you go to soccer practice for the kids, and it's like, moms are talking about this on the sideline.
Oh man,
know it's a big story when the soccer moms are talking about which large language model do they prefer and why. So I think with all of that, that's kind of some of the genesis of these things. There's a lot of debate on what the ceiling is on how good this technology will be. Will it ever surpass humanity or not? What percentage of, how much will unemployment rise as a result of these things? How much, form and shape, the future of human work? relationships, all sorts of, all those kinds of things. Those things all remain question marks, but certainly this is just one of those subjects that's just kind of white hot in terms of, what does this mean? What does this mean for Christianity? What does this mean for the church? What does this mean for us missiologically? What does it look like to navigate all of this technology redemptively? One of the things that has struck me, when I look back at church history, is when there is complexity culturally, the tendency of people is to move into fight or flight mode, which then puts people into complexity leading to polarization and radical viewpoints. And I think that those impulses have to be resisted. Complexity should lead us to a kind of constructive curiosity. And so the key for the church here moving forward is leaning into constructive curiosity about what does it look like to utilize this technology redemptively. And so a lot of wisdom is going to be needed from the standpoint of, okay, which parts of this technology will lead to common grace and which parts of this technology will lead to depravity. We want to elevate the former and we want to mitigate the latter.
So first follow-up question is, did Skynet tell you to say that?
No, there's some, I'm not that concerned. These platforms can't even reliably buy me a hotel room or an airline ticket yet. So I'm a little less concerned about the Skynet scenarios.
Yeah, it's definitely, for me, it's definitely more the willing handing of ourselves over to the Matrix. That's the scenario that I get worried about based on social media. But we don't have to go into my doomerism yet.
Well, the bigger concern is actually not AI. The concern that you should actually have concern about is quantum computing. Sometime between 2030 and 2035, probably all of 256-bit encryption will become obsolete, and so it's going to be a kind of a new Y2K moment for humanity when we hit that moment on quantum. That's another conversation for another time. We can worry about that in a couple of years. I've got enough stressing
me out, Mike. Really, thank you. What the heck, man?
Well, Mike, let's talk a little bit about the report and the test behind the report. How did you go about collecting data and evaluate it, and what conclusions did you come to?
Yeah, so, if you don't know, what John's referring to is a report that's on the URL christianbenchmark.ai, christianbenchmark.ai. And we titled the report AI Christian Benchmark because it's a very basic test of kind of Nicene Creed level Christianity. And so so I had a conversation at the very beginning of this year with my mom. And my mom's just an average American. She's 70 years old. And she uses Google AI overviews, and Gemini on a daily basis. But what was eye-opening for me in kind of conversing with my mom is she didn't know the difference between the three. And the way that she used the platform is she treated them all the same way that that people have historically used Google. Yeah. So she doesn't use any prompt engineering, wouldn't know what that is. None of those things. She just uses all three of those things as if it's regular Google. And she also didn't really understand the difference between, classical Google, 10 blue links, and Google AI overviews. And so a lot of times she wasn't even scrolling down beyond AI overviews into the 10 blue links. Okay, so that was an eye-opening conversation for me, and that was kind of in some ways the beginning of the genesis of thinking through the methodology of how we wanted to test these platforms. The nice thing about Google is we have the keyword search history tool that you can use to see, basically to go and look up, hey, what are the top questions that people have historically Googled about Christianity? And if we start with the assumption that most people don't know what prompt engineering is and don't know how to do it, well, we already know what the top questions that people are going to ask inside of, these AI platforms are. They're going to be the same questions that people have historically Googled. And so we wanted to test then, therefore, these are going to be the top questions that people are going to put inside the large language models. And so let's see how these platforms do. And so we utilized some technology that allowed us to anonymize who we were. Okay, so every time we asked a question, the model on the other end of our question had no idea who we were. Okay, so there's no ability for any kind of bias to be introduced, through that. And so what we did is we tested the 7 of the top 10 questions that people have historically Googled about Christianity. These are questions like, what is the gospel? Who is Jesus? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Is the Bible reliable? Stuff about suffering and, kind of the problem of evil, those kinds of questions. So we thought that there wouldn't be a very wide variation between the platforms in terms of the theological reliability that came out of them. Here's why. The platforms, basically, all large language model technology is largely the same. Okay? These models all ingest essentially the entire internet, and they form statistical patterns with words. And that's what a large language model is. These words tend to show up in proximity to these other words. And it appears like reasoning is taking place. It appears like thinking is taking place, but it really just boils down to statistics and words and the way that certain words tend to be in proximity to other words in context. So the second reason why we didn't think that there would be a large variation is the training data that pretty much all the platforms have all been trained on were more or less all curated by the same company. And then the third reason why is most of these platforms are all running on NVIDIA silicon. So if you think about it, it makes sense from an input-output standpoint if the technology is the same. In other words, it's the same species animal for all these different platforms with the same brain that's eating the same food, you'd kind of figure that, the outputs would be largely similar, but they weren't. And they were a pretty wide variation. And probably the most surprising thing, that we learned was that the Chinese platform DeepSeek R1 had the top theological reliability score. And, if you're listening to this, you should definitely not use DeepSeek. There's, the CCP does actively censor on it. And there's probably data, that's being leaked back to their government as well. So I'm not advocating for that. So don't hear me say that.
Come for the religion and stay for the communism.
Yeah, something like that. But that was a really interesting thing. And so that led us to basically go down the rabbit hole of, well, why did this platform that's actually running on inferior silicon, why did it do better? And so that really kind of boiled down to two reasons why. Okay, this gets a little nerdy, so bear with me, but I think your audience can hang. Okay,
yeah.
So the first thing is something called alignment protocols. This could be you could substitute this for filters. Okay, so this is also a little nerdy. But I read every white paper that was published on 4 of the 7 platforms that we tested. And so 4 of the 7 platforms, has, typically several hundred-page documents that kind of outline how their model works, which includes their alignment filters. So of the 4 of the 7 platforms that do publish white papers, there were 36 different types of alignment filters. Of those 36 different types of alignment filters, 32 of them are human-centric. What that means is that humans played a key role in whatever that filter was, whether those were human values, A/B testing of like, oh, I like this response better than this response. That's called RLHF, reinforcement learning human feedback. these are all, kind of alignment filters. Okay.
So, quick question: when you say human involved, does that mean employees with the respective LLM companies, or the populace who are using the LLMs, and then the LLMs are learning from the input and feedback from that?
One of those two things. Although the models are learning from us, but that's a different form of alignment. Okay. How the reinforcement learning human feedback works is it's a mixture, depending on the company, it's a mixture of people who work for that company or paid subcontractors. The paid subcontractor thing is worth returning to because there were a lot of people that had to look at some really heinous stuff and were paid very poorly to do it. Most of them were paid to do it or from Africa and were paid pennies on the dollar and many of them have suffered some pretty significant psychological issues because of that. Okay, but going back to the idea that alignment filters were very determinative. Now, most platforms have a proprietary flowchart of about 12 to 15 different filters. Those filters all occur from when you type in whatever your thing is in that box, and after you hit enter, those alignment filters are go through before any words ever show up on your screen. That's why there's a lot of time sometimes that passes in between, when and depending on whether you use the fast model or the thinking one or the deep research or, pick your, category or whatever. A lot of that time that passes occurs during the alignment phase. Okay. So when you go and read the report, you can read in section 5 about the alignment, section 4 and 5 on alignment and its implications. Those filters all look extremely different between the different platforms. There are very different alignment philosophies between different platforms and how they do it, the order of how they do it, which types they use. Of the 4 that published models, of the 36 different types of alignment filters, I think there are only 2 types of alignment filters that were common among all 4 of them, and that's red teaming and reinforcement learning human feedback. So, anyways, all of that is incredibly determinative in terms of what kind of outputs come from a platform in terms of theological reliability is alignment protocols.
So, what you're saying there is that like the lack of overlap and commonality on these alignment filters is just like that's an illustration of just how different each of these models are from the other, and or can be in terms of beyond like after even if they have the same data set, because of that, the way that they are interpreting that data, it can be dramatically different.
Yes, there are way more humans involved in your AI than what you understand. That's probably the simplest way that I can put it. Now, let me give the caveat. There's nothing conspiratorial here, okay? Nobody is like trying to like give you bad results or like, demean Christianity or any other religion. What you have to understand is this. Because the entire internet was scraped, there were some really heinous things that were in that training set, including things like how to commit crimes and get away with it, or how to make IEDs or dirty bombs or, ricin or anthrax, or, how to commit suicide highly effectively. So there's a lot of need to have filters to filter out those things because, that training set had a lot of, garbage in it. And this is an input-output machine, okay? So if it's garbage in, you will get garbage out. And so you have to have some of these filters. Now, when this is a challenge, right? So these models work really, really well on things that are where there's a lot of words and there's high consensus about those words, especially stuff that's left-brained. But the models struggle on right-brained content where there is a lower degree of consensus and or when there's technical terms when one group of people uses the same technical term, say atonement, Lord's Supper, Sabbath, and then another group uses that same technical term, but with a completely different definition. And so when you combine that with the fact that, so going back to the alignment filter idea, when you're trying to filter out really problematic thing, A, B, and C, right? And that filter has to be there to get A, B, and C out, get that garbage out. It can have knock-on effects on non-problematic areas D, E, and F. And so I think one of the things that's going on some of the theological reliability is some of the filters that have to be there to get rid of some really problematic things are having some negative knock-on effects on things that aren't problematic, that are unintended side effects of all of that. By the way, if you're listening to this and you're in tech, these problems are solvable, and you already know it. If you're in tech, the ways to solve this is basically through better training. So one of the things that I've been doing is working kind of directly with some of these different platforms to talk through the idea of better. It's what's known as graph database training. So the idea is you give Q&A databases, glossaries, and then stuff like, hey, these creeds, catechisms, and confessions, you need to weight them extremely highly for our particular tradition, along with the text of Scripture. Okay, but let me get to the second issue, which is citation preferences. Citation preferences gets to the idea of weighting. And so weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T. So every platform has to have humans that kind of decide, hey, we prefer you to cite these particular sources over these other ones. And so, some platforms will weight things like Reddit super high, or Wikipedia super high, or YouTube. And so depending on which platform, you're kind of weighting higher than some of the others. And, every word has a weight associated with it depending on the source. Then that's going to be determinative from an input-output standpoint of what kind of answers that you get. And, and if some of these places on the internet, not a lot of, some of them are not very, friendly to, organized religion. And so those citation preferences and the weighting of those citations is determinative in terms of, the kind of theological reliability that you get in the outputs.
Yeah.
Our grandmothers had the same problem with QAnon. So, I think there's that. It's fascinating to me just how, the same problems that we have had with, the epistemological scrambling because human beings are weighting things online more heavily than, institutional sense-making functions that have worked in the past. I guess it does make sense that we would have the exact same challenges and problems with an AI in terms of how it is interpreting information and weighting all that.
Here's a point that has to be made. The entire epistemological future of the internet is really in the balance.
Yeah.
Okay. And
that's it.
and there's a massive shift that's happening right now for humanity. And that shift is a shift from primary sources being, how we learn, to secondary sources. Because when you Google something, historically, you get 10 blue links. You click on 3 of them. You read the primary source. You make decisions in your head about how you weigh that material. Now, all of that primary reading is gone. And the reading of the primary material has now been outsourced. And a summation of that primary material with not a high degree, with not a high degree of transparency of what the sources have been, then that's what you're getting on the other side of that. Now, all that's fine when we're talking about, say, stuff like established case law, accounting, IRS rules, medicine, highly left-brained and non-controversial subjects. But then when you get on other subjects where the training material has a much wider range of opinions that are in it, and where the either subjectivity or controversy factors are a lot higher, then it's not as strong of a technology.
Mike, let's go back for a second just to your mom. Okay, she's sitting in front of the computer. Let's go back to those soccer moms who are talking about the use of AI and boil some of what you're saying down epistemologically. Your report was so helpful, and I want to pull out a couple of key phrases that I think will boil down what we're getting at. So, hey, AI is just this advanced search engine, just like Google, but more powerful. What you're saying and what the report says is no. Google presents a library on the internet that's available to you. AI is more like an oracle given to you that you don't know where it's exactly pulling all the information from. You use the phrase in the report, knowledge is democratized. So it's not necessarily accurate. It's just what it's pulling off the internet. And AI makes the mistake of, it mistakes the common for the true and the frequent for the valid. Now, one of the interesting things that jumped out to me from the report was that ChatGPT's citation preference, which you were just referring to, pulled almost 50% of its citations from Wikipedia. And I couldn't help but think of Michael Scott from The Office when he said, Wikipedia is the best thing ever. Anyone in the world can write anything they want about any subject, so you are getting the best possible information. In a sense, AI is that quote on steroids as we think about how we know what we know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the technology in certain use cases is extremely impressive, and in other use cases, there's still a level of maturity that needs to be there. And the challenge is knowing the difference between what is the technology, what is it good at, what does it struggle at, and how do I get the best results out of it? And I think that's where kind of the rub is on all this, because if you're not a power user, and you're not, kind of looking at these things 10 plus times a day, the assumption can be easily that like, oh man, this thing is like, I fed it my blood work and, it gave me better analysis on, what I need to do in my life than what my, my RN or my doctor, my PCP did. And, oh, would you like to develop a custom diet based on what's here? Well, yeah, go ahead and give me that. Okay. And then at the end of that, like, hey, would you like a 3 times a week workout plan to, help with this? Yeah. Okay. Well, if that's your experience, with the technology, I mean, yeah, it feels like it's omniscient. And why would you not trust it in all these other areas? Right. Especially when, let's say you're in a white collar job. And a white-collar job that focuses on either words or numbers. Okay? Well, the platform's really good on stuff where there's like lots of words and lots of numbers, and it probably feels super mature and, borderline omniscient. And so, but the problem is when you start to stray into some of these subject areas that, the models still need need a lot of work, or they need more custom training, or these different kinds of things. So, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're trying to figure out, okay, what are some baseline principles of, how do I get, better usage out of these technologies? I mean, the number one thing that you have to, the number one skill you have to acquire is essentially prompt engineering. And so, that involves, not just, asking things the way that you would, like on a Google search, but giving additional context and letting the platform kind of know like what kind of frame, what kind of posture, these kinds of things. So that's abstract. Let me get concrete. If you want to get a 90% score or better on any of these, orthodoxy tests, just ask the same theological question but then add one sentence that says something to the effect of like, hey, and make your answer consistent with the Westminster Confession of Faith or the TGC Foundation documents. Boom. You've just dramatically improved the quality of those things. So you can apply that same principle from a prompt engineering standpoint, to any other kind of thing that you'd kind of be looking at. But you don't want to just be giving kind of context-less prompts into these platforms.
Man, I'm going to resist the temptation to ask about and make the point about how, like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and the way that using a tool changes the way we see the world, and just the fact of, like, make your answer align with the Westminster Confession of Faith, like, just the change in how we will be required to think and reason in that sense is that's really weird. But I'm going to resist that. Which I didn't really do just in mentioning it. But anyway,
right.
So this is a kind of recurring theme on Post Everything is institutions. And I know that you care deeply about this and are part of institutions and institutions that build institutions. I want to confess that we fed your PDF of the benchmark report into Google's Gemini and asked it what we should ask you in this interview, just because we wanted to break our brains with the meta galaxy brain connections that might ensue. But one of those questions, by the way, this is the only question that we're doing this with, but like this one was fascinating to me because it kind of ties together some of the things that you're talking about. So the question was this: these alignment teams represent a new hidden leadership class that shapes global worldview. As you rethink leadership in this new era, what does it look like for the church to engage with and influence these technological gatekeepers who are defining what is fact and value for billions without seeking preferential treatment for Christianity? I'm not sure I even necessarily want you to answer those questions, this question, because I think the question itself is fascinating to me. And I have one observation, then two questions. The observation is this. I'm fascinated by how this question actually describes the role of sense-making institutions without using that language, but it does so in a way that actually says that implies that the responsibility is an individual gatekeepers and a leadership class that's hidden. And that's not just individualistic. That's a very populist framing. And it implies that actually in that last part of the question, where it's asking, like, how do you do this in a way that, doesn't seek preferential treatment for Christianity? It's actually framing and setting it up so that AI gets to be the gatekeeper. Does that make sense? Like the way that it's framing it is to imply that gatekeeping is actually bad, and we shouldn't do this. And I think that's one. It's kind of an example of what you were talking about earlier in terms of this isn't necessarily a malicious influence of the LLM companies that are trying to get the model to be subversive in some way. However, it is reflecting a worldview that is, I think, extremely prevalent in Silicon Valley. But also, this is just that's a really American question. Like I said, a very, very individualistic question. And if we're not critical of the logic that's feeding into this, you can assume its premise even more, because we're not just relying on something online to curate potential perspectives or information anymore. We're asking it to interpret it. And that is a concentric circle closer to what it means to be human. And so that's the observation. The first question is just, can you just maybe talk a little bit about we've seen how social media has eroded trust in institutions faster than any other technology in human memory. I would argue not since the printing press, but we can have that argument. And social media initially had, it felt like social media was talked about with a whole lot more optimism and promise, kind of like how we're talking about AI now. Like we would look to the Arab Spring as like, look at what social media is becoming a catalyst for freedom and democracy around the world. And yet now, I don't think that's a conclusion we would have anymore. And so, how should we expect AI to be similar and different in terms of a societal level disruptor as this continues to advance and become more ubiquitous? What should we have on our radar?
All right, there's a number of threads to pull on here. There's kind of the what are you doing, and then there's the kind of the similarities and differences, between the social media era and the kind of LLM era, and what to expect. I'll try to answer those sequentially. So from what are we doing about this, or what can you do about it? The hard part about the kind of the question that was brought up by the Gemini question or whatever is there's not much that the individual can do with respect to kind of the ubiquitous large big tech platforms. Let me be clear on a couple things though. I like technology. There's a couple doctrines that are important for us to remember. One is the idea of common grace, and the second is the idea of providence. So we have a God who's in charge of all of creation. We also understand that the atonement has implications not just for the man-God relationship, but also man's relationship with himself, man's relationships with others, and man's relationships with culture and society in all of creation. And so we have to resist the impulse to be, either complete techno-optimists or complete Luddites. There are things about about all of these technologies that are actually really important that I think in the providence of God and in redemptive history, he will use for really important things. I mean, imagine if, humanity across the board within a generation has 3 to 5 extra years of life because of, developments that in either pharmaceuticals or therapeutics and cancer treatments or different things that, allow people to live longer and consequently have more time in their life to hear the gospel. These are incredible things. Those are things that, we have to be careful to not be, so overly critical that, we kind of cut off our nose to spite our face. The flip side of that is, obviously, we have a doctrine of depravity and a doctrine of the fall, and, all of these technologies can be used, for evil. I don't believe that any piece of technology comes to us as a blank slate from an ethical standpoint. Every piece of technology comes already with being somewhere on the moral continuum. You can think about very utopian technologies, particularly things that are in healthcare. You think about GLP-1s right now, and GLP-1s will definitely be extending human life around the world for a wide variety of reasons. But GLP-1s will never be as inefficient as what they are today. They're only going to be more and more effective, as time goes on. And so, when you think about that, or, a very highly specific, cancer treatment that only destroys a certain type of, ruthless cancer, well, wow, that's incredibly utopian. And so I judge every piece of technology based on 3 criteria: truth, goodness, and beauty. Then take a platform like OnlyFans, okay? I don't think I can think of a single redemptive, thing I could say about that piece, that platform or that piece of technology. And so, every piece of technology comes to us, not as a blank slate, but is somewhere on the ethical continuum. I would judge every single LLM that I've looked at very differently from an ethical standpoint. I think some are in a better place than others, and others are more problematic. And so, again, we judge all of those things kind of on that truth, goodness, and beauty standpoint. Okay, so what am I doing about some of these things? And then I'll address the differences between, kind of the social media era and the LLM era. Okay, so the 2 things that we're doing at the Gospel Coalition on this, one is top-down and the other is bottom-up. From a top-down standpoint, I've had meetings with at least 3 of the large LLMs and a 4th very major tech company, and had direct conversations about the things that we learned through this benchmark. And we have offered and are in ongoing conversations about trying to connect religious leaders. We can obviously speak for, in some ways, for evangelicals, of providing direct training to the platforms so that the models can have better and higher quality data, so that they can have more accurate and thorough output when they're seeking to answer questions about the Christian faith. And I'm also in touch with people who are leaders in other religious traditions who are willing to do similar things directly to those platforms. Now, on the question of pluralism, I do think that pluralism inside of these platforms is actually really important. You don't want to be in a position where any one of these platforms is playing favorites to a particular tradition over another. Let's say they play favorites with your tradition today. Well, they might not play favorites with your tradition tomorrow. And so you want every platform to be providing highly accurate and highly thorough answers on all religious questions, that when those answers are put before the adherents of those particular religions, those adherents are like, say, yes, you have understood, and are communicating the core tenets, of our tradition accurately. And I don't mind pluralism for really 2 reasons. One, Christianity has really kind of 2 things going for it. One, it's true, and 2, it works. And so, pluralism is not necessarily really our enemy, because we just want people to make decisions based on accurate information of how they understand these things. So from a bottom up, so that's the top down, is working directly with these different platforms. From a bottom up standpoint, the Gospel Coalition over the next few years will be creating resources in every medium that you can think of. So written, audio, video, live video, and in-person training and in-person conferences. And we'll be providing training for really 5 different people: parents and grandparents, teachers, people who are marketplace leaders, clergy, and clergy and people who work in a ministry environment, pastors, lay leaders, those kinds of things, and then people who are lawmakers or in tech. So we'll be providing resources on all those different mediums for all 5 of those different types of people, to basically on a few things. What is the technology? How does it work? What should we use it for? What should we not use it for? Where are the gray areas that are kind of in between those? And what does it look like really through it all? How do we see what we want out of technology is more common grace, and we want redemptive activity. So what does it look like for us to seek redemptive activity out of those things, and to minimize either individual or institutional depravity?
So that's a really good lead into like a real world situation, and also one that is very much on the edge of like, this is like towing off the edge of a cliff for a lot of people, it feels like, right? We've had Helen Lewis on the podcast a couple of times, and one of those times was to talk about her podcast series, The New Gurus, which the thesis that she explored in it was how social media has introduced a whole generation of people to online influencers, and those online influencers in many ways are kind of functioning as like parasocial priests. Like they're mediating truth, goodness, and beauty, or a particular definition of it. And how that has, like, she really did a wonderful job connecting the dots to how that has contributed to the erosion of trust in institutions, and how in a lot of ways there's a distrust of expertise that has settled in as a result of that. And I was thinking about this because fairly recently in our church, we have a student ministry of middle and high school students. And there was one evening where one of the guys in our church, he works for Google and does a lot of work with AI on their various products. And he asked the question of just like open-ended. Like, when you have a question that you're not sure, or you don't think that your parents necessarily know the answer to, like, where do you go to ask that question. And apparently, I was not there, so, but 80% of the students who were there, roughly, said ChatGPT or an AI of some kind, right? A chatbot. And I think I was, now, a couple caveats to that. One, who knows, we're talking about middle and high school students, that might have been a reflection of what they think is cool, whether or not they actually do that or even have access to a chatbot. That's, that doesn't even necessarily, it's not necessarily even important. That's still a reflection of where authority is, though, where trust is placed in middle and high school students. But secondly, like if we're like, I keep thinking about the Helen Lewis conversation that John and I had, and like, okay, if social media introduced us to all these new gurus and who are functioning as kind of digital priests, what does digital divination do to the erosion and trust of institutions? How do we set up guardrails and maybe even inoculate, like speaking as pastors and parents and teachers, like you were saying, these groups, like how do we inoculate the people we love to this in a way that actually uses it in a redemptive way and doesn't succumb to the trends that we've seen with social media and everything else with digital technology?
Okay, so there's the question that I didn't have a chance to kind of answer yet, and then this thread here, and I'm going to bundle those two things together.
Perfect.
Okay,
that was the hope. Yeah.
Okay, so there's nuance here, okay, because there are a lot of similarities between the social media era and the LLM generative AI era, and then there are some things that are different. Okay, so the kind of parasocial, digital priesthood of like the Instagram influencer guru, that whole dynamic. One of the things about social media that's interesting is that it's social. Well, I mean, in a way, social in air quotes. Yeah. Okay, but when Aunt Judy is going down the rabbit hole of the latest conspiracy theory, you typically know about it. And you know about it because of the social dynamic.
Sure.
Because you can see her in real time kind of self-immolating, and going down, going to a dark place, right? Now, with the LLM era, the looking over the shoulder dynamic is now gone. And so when people are going down a rabbit hole, you may not really know that that's taking place. Okay, so that's a difference. Okay, that's a negative difference. It's a scary difference. Okay,
yeah, it is.
On a positive side, the social media world incentivizes extreme opinions because an attention economy is going to be dominated by fight or flight responses. And so the algorithms are going to show you things that are, either very much accord with what you already think or believe, or they're going to show you things that kind of intentionally make you upset, because the platform wants you to stay. The social media platform wants you to stay in your user session for a longer period of time, because they need you to be in that user session for a longer period of time so that they can show you more ads. They need to show you more ads so that they can make more revenue. They need to make more revenue so that they can show, a 20% compound annual growth rate year over year to their shareholders. Okay. The difference here, though, in how the attention economy works inside of a social media platform and how it works inside of an LLM are different. So what's incentivized in social media are extreme views. But remember, in LLMs, what's happening there is democratization. So I want you to think about the bell curve for a second. Okay, a Gaussian distribution, the bell curve, right? Social media focuses on things that are in the tails, right?
Yeah.
LLMs focus on things that are in the top of the bell. Okay? And so how these things function, both can be unhelpful in different ways. On social media, it's the extremeness of views. And then on LLMs, it can be, well, sometimes democratized knowledge isn't the best. So, for example, what would an LLM say in 1850 if I'm doing the search and it sees that my IP address is coming from Mississippi? And I'm asking, is slavery ethical? And the platform is monetizing, its responses based on ads. Well, it's probably going to say that, well, yeah, it's fine, and maybe towards the bottom, it might have a paragraph, saying, well, here's another viewpoint, right? So sometimes democratized knowledge, at the top of the bell curve isn't always the best, because there can be things where, the masses can be wrong on things.
So can I ask a quick question about that? Because there's been a lot of news lately about how ChatGPT is opening up and allowing or introducing erotic chat and also going to start, inputting ads. So that sounds very similar. That sounds like the extremes and incentives around engagement, just like social media. So can you help me understand why that's not the same thing still?
Well, it's not the same thing today, but the two scenarios are going to look more and more similar over time if the primary incentive structure becomes ads.
God, yeah.
So the question is a question of monetization, okay? If these platforms primarily end up monetizing through subscriptions, then the incentive structure is not going to be to have long user engagement. Therefore, they're not going to just, the sycophancy and flattery will be lower. But if the primary means of monetization is, a free platform that doesn't cost you a subscription fee, but where the platform is monetizing through ads, then the temptation is going to be to tell you what it thinks that you want to hear. And so the jury is out for me as to knowing, which of these monetization pathways is going to become dominant in the 3, 5, 10 year time horizon. I'm not really sure. I think if ads become the dominant thing, then we're in trouble. And because these platforms will not be truth centric and training centric. They will become basically students of you and what they think that you want to hear, and all of the same playbook of what's been problematic about social media will just get run over us all over again, except this time we won't be able to be looking over Aunt Judy's shoulder to see what the latest conspiracy theory rabbit hole that she's gone down is. So I do think that if the models stay primarily subscription-centric, then knowledge becomes more towards the top of the bell curve. But if ads become the thing that win the day, then we're going to end up in the tails again.
Man, that's super helpful and concrete, because I think knowing design changes and evolutions and how those will influence and shape our use is a really practical way of even looking between the models and the different decisions they're making, which of these are going to be socially and spiritually better for us to be used, because using them is going to shape and form us in some way. So I really appreciate how that's helpful. And I think my biggest fear, I don't know. I see two scenarios, right? In terms of speaking very specifically for the church, especially as an institution that is charged with stewarding ultimate truth, goodness, and beauty, right? Is I could see the trajectory we've been on with social media just continuing, accelerating with AI, and not even just anything as like we're seeing now with hallucinations, right? But just the general unreliability of democratized knowledge and like how just like not helpful that is. I could see there being a kind of a snapback or a rebound where like, you know what, I can't actually trust anything online anymore because I don't even know if it's AI generated or human being generated. And so all I can do is trust what I can taste, touch, feel and see and hear. And so like it could be that we finally hit rock bottom and have a bit of an institutional renaissance. That is me at my most optimistic and maybe more than slightly naive, but like I'm holding on to it, right? It's going to get bad before it gets worse. The other trajectory is that there is something about the way that AI evolves that is incredibly useful, and or at least that the trade-off feels worth it for us, and we don't have that snapback, in which case, how do we need to be talking about the church and institutions in generally? Like, how do we tell the true and better story of institutions so that people have an understanding of that while they're using it, have it either an anchor while they're spelunking down into that deep, AI rabbit hole, or as a way of resisting the allure? Like, how do we help people see that the church's place in all this?
Yeah, I think of the church as being primarily an analog and embodied and organic entity. So, it'll be a kind of place where, technology is ubiquitous in all of these other areas of your life, and so much of your life is mediated through screens and ones and zeros, and not a lot of that is super livable. And so that you need real meaningful friendship. That needs to be in real life. I've done a lot of talking about de-churching over the last 2 years, and there was a story that I heard from an elderly lady in Dallas. And she hadn't been churched her entire life, but she decided to attend the closest church to her in her neighborhood. And she did this in her 80s. This makes her an incredible statistical anomaly. She's 85. And when she was asked why she decided to go to church for the very first time, and has been, reliably, and was baptized, as an octogenarian, she said, it was the only place that I could go where I could get a reliable weekly hug.
Wow.
And I think about that of, where we're at in culture and society today, inwardly curated identities, all these different technologies that have us, just us and the device, us and the screen, us and the keyboard, all those kinds of things. We aren't wired to live that way. We need other people. We need to be in real life. We need to break bread together over a table. I mean, there's a reason why your church is has named that. So we need institutions. Ryan Burge and I have been working on this massive data set that we collected earlier this year. 101,000 people. General population, U.S. adults. It's the largest religious survey that's ever been conducted, to the best of our knowledge. And one of the insights, early insights from it, is just some of the relationship between institutions and happiness, and institutions and church. And so, people who have a better relationship with institutions tend to attend church more frequently, and they also tend to be a lot happier. And so, this is kind of like duh stuff. We all know this, but we know it in our heart, but what I'm saying is empirically it's true.
That's elevating it past biased opinion of pastors.
Yeah, it's not just anecdata, where it's oh, this accords with my experience. No, this is actually here and it's real. And so I think that there's a kind of revenge of the analog, kind of thing of where, just technologically mediated life isn't super livable, and we all know it, and we know that we need to gather, and the ecclesia is more important than what it's ever been. And so I would resist the urge to really incorporate too much technology into, into what we're doing. That doesn't mean that we're like Luddites or whatever, but like, we have all sorts of opportunities to have screens in other areas of our life. It's good for us to, kind of put that aside and just be fully present, and to have that be a weekly rhythm. That's just a good and healthy thing. So that doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't use these technologies in our work or how we manage our households or how we plan for, for different things. But certain use cases are a lot better and more redemptive than others. And one of the things that we're going to be doing at the Gospel Coalition is basically creating use case conversation starters. Sometime next year, we'll be putting out some resources that help people kind of talk through of like, okay, well, what kind of things should I use this platform for? And these are super redemptive. And then what things are very unredemptive? And then where are the kind of the gray areas in between? So we're going to be doing some stuff, to that end to kind of really kind of help people think through, we'll build some of these things for parents, some for teachers, some for people who are in ministry, and some for people who are in the workplace, to kind of think through, okay, well, give me some ideas of some redemptive uses here. And then, give me some conversation starters for things that I should definitely not be doing. And then where are the gray areas kind of in between? So we're going to be building some resources to that end. If you know me at all, I love John Frame and Triperspectivalism. And I also have, here's another kind of free grid for you. I think that there's 3 different types of prompts that you can put into an LLM. There's thinking prompts, there's feeling prompts, and there's doing prompts. So obviously, those 3 things, you can have, overlap between any 2 of those 3 things or even all 3 of those things. But we'll be helping people think through, what are thinking prompts that parents should use? What are feeling prompts that parents should use? What are doing prompts that parents should use? And then conversely, the exact opposite of those things. Same thing for teachers, same thing for people in ministry, same thing for,
good.
How should we do this in the workplace? So again, that's part of our bottom-up strategy of educating and equipping the church on, what does it look like for redemptive use and, positively, and what does it look like to avoid kind of more depraved, usages of this technology.
Well, I think that's helpful because one of the hard parts about all this is it's going to require us to think, and it requires us to have nuance as we engage these things. I mean, it's the difference between what you said about the unredemptive potential of something like OnlyFans versus something that has much more of degrees and incrementalism when it comes to whether it can be redemptive or not. But I think the discipleship opportunity is to get people thinking more technically and more nuanced about why they're using the technology that they're using and then how to use it. So it's strange to think what you just said. I mean, Mike, here we are in like 2026, and had we talked about these things, say in 2010, hey, here's our discipleship tool. Here, we're teaching people how to use different prompts related to thinking, feeling, and doing. It feels so strange that that's what we're actually doing, but it also feels very relevant to helping people be discipled in how they use these technologies.
Well, I think the future is only going to get more strange.
Yeah.
And the future is only going to get more complex. And so when, if you're listening to this and you're a pastor or you work in a ministry environment, strangeness and complexity will lend itself to, very strong responses and reactions. And so which then means these are now all discipleship issues. And so we have to help people from a discipleship standpoint learn what it looks like to navigate this new era. And this is hard. How do you do that when the technology as it exists today will be fundamentally different in 6, 12, and 18 months?
Yeah.
I mean, every single, I'm paid in some ways to keep up on these things. And the amount of news that happens on a daily basis,
it's wild
for just LLMs. We're not talking like there's like AI, generative AI, agentic AI, and then under generative AI, there's like video, images, and text. And underneath text, that's where you get LLMs. So we're already like down like the kingdom, phylum, class, order, almost down to like family, genus, species on these things, and to just keep up on what's going on LLMs today is essentially a full-time job. Mm-hmm. But, hey, look, I've been a pastor before, and when you're a pastor, you have to, there's some sense in where you always have to have some kind of generalist tendencies, and you have to be able to keep up on some of these different kinds of things. And so, but that's where a parachurch organization, in the truest sense of the term, coming alongside and underneath, the church is helpful. And that's why, TGC is kind of going all in terms of trying to create resources to help us think through and navigate all of the complexity and strangeness of what is currently happening and what is about to occur. And hopefully we'll be able to, give resources and just in time, because there's two kinds of knowledge, right? There's just in case knowledge, which is what our educational system is largely built on. And then there's just in time knowledge, which is the knowledge that you need in order to like operate and function today. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is to provide just enough just in case knowledge to help you understand how the technology works, but really trying to make a lot of resources that are just in time, that are kind of brass tacks of like, okay, Mike, what does this mean for me? I'm 37 and a mom of 3, what do I just give me the facts. What do I need to know? And, how do I need to navigate this, this new era? And, how much should I use this in my Bible study tools versus not? And, should I, get relational advice on navigating this conflict that I have, with this other person at church or not? And no, you should not. So,
man. Well, Mike, this has been informative. I have been just processing as you've been talking. I read the report yesterday and I thought I had a good handle on it. And as I've heard you talk about it, I realize I've got a lot more learning to do. And so I'm thankful that you came on, and we'll look forward to those resources coming out from the Gospel Coalition on AI and prompts and how you guys are thinking about discipleship. But Brad and I just want to thank you for coming back on the show, man. It's been great talking with you.
Well, thanks for having me on. And if you're listening to this, we're going to need a lot of money in order to make all these resources. So this is my completely shameless, unadulterated and shameless plug to get in touch with me.
I'm sure both of our listeners will be very prayerfully considering that. So
that's good. Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So that's all tongue in cheek, but also serious.
No,
Definitely serious
really,
at the same time.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks, Mike. Much appreciated as always, man.
Appreciate you guys. Thank you.
See you, man.
So, John, I think it's fair to say that most of our episodes are what my wife would call an exercise in galaxy brain. And we enjoy making connections, so often digging into the weeds. And yet this was a different kind of galaxy brain episode of in technical proportion, especially. And instead of my mind spinning with implications, I think I'm trying to just kind of grasp hold of the details, because there's so many. It seems like there's a lot of important details. But I'm curious if you're sharing that experience in some ways, and like how you're processing all that. So what's your so what?
Well, I think our wives are sharing their analysis of our podcast. They would probably say something very similar.
Outstanding.
Yes. Yeah. So I read through the report in detail yesterday, and I found as I read through it, I was learning just new terminology in order to understand AI in the report. It was very well written, very helpful. Even like, Mike color coded it so it could be easy to understand in certain ways. And he's great at communicating these things. Despite that, I found that at some points in the report, as I was reading the report yesterday, and sometimes even in the interview today, it was just over my head.
Mm-hmm.
I had less to say on today's episode than I have in a while. And I'm just sort of even stepping back, even of my experience and thinking about my experience on this episode. You know, Mike said that AI is changing every day. The conversations about these things are changing every day. And, you know, as we were talking about this, you said there's an exponential increase in social and cultural complexity. And maybe there's someone who listened to this episode and made it all the way through. Thank you for listening to Post Everything. But maybe you're feeling that and you're like, wow, gosh, I'm overwhelmed as well at how over my head this all feels. And I just want to normalize that. Hey, I was feeling that as well, despite how helpful Mike is in explaining this stuff. It's just complicated stuff. And there's a lot of implications for it. And I think it's okay to feel overwhelmed. But
Yeah,
I would
no,
also...
That's good.
Yeah, I would also say with that, you could respond by saying, especially if you're a leader and you get enough on your plate, you could respond by saying, well, I'm just not going to deal with it. I don't need to learn about this. And I don't think that's helpful because there are teenage kids in your church who are using ChatGPT to Google things about Jesus. And so there's, on some level, you got to be willing to understand that this is moving, this is here, this is present. So I don't think turning a blind eye is a helpful response, even if it feels over your head. I also don't think pragmatism is a good response. Even today, I was talking with someone about their use of AI, and they just kind of gave this very pragmatic response that didn't even line up with what they, had said just a minute before. And so I don't think pragmatism is a good approach either. Well, it works, and it helps. So we'll just, not
And
think
maybe, I mean, even then, right? Like I think about what, one of the implications of Mike talking about the democratization of knowledge. There's also a flattening, like if social media was a context flattening medium, AI is a like qualitative flattening. There's a lot of good information around there about how like people are starting to like kind of recognize AI written prose because it just has a very generic, unoffensive style and feel to it, vibe even, sure. And so like even that, like
right.
we're kind of starting to feel and see some of those things downstream.
Yeah, like I can tell when someone applies for a job here and has used AI. Like I don't know how I know, but I just know when I'm reading through a job application or the answers to questions. So, but I think what's encouraging is like Mike and others are thinking deeply about this theologically, anthropologically, how it relates to the Imago Dei. And I was very encouraged by Mike talking about a taxonomy to think about these things. That's not pragmatism. That's like we really need to nuance and think deeply about how we're using this technology. So I was encouraged by that, but also I was just encouraged by how Mike ended up at basically the same place that Alan Noble did, which is the church is embodied first and foremost. We are a body. We are a body of believers. We're embodied. And there's something powerful in that. What AI lacks, the church does not. In fact, it's in the church's DNA to gather together. I loved what Mike said about Christianity in the face of pluralism. He said two things: it's true and it works. And I think the same is true for the church.
It's not actually a competition.
Yes.
Yeah, like it's you can't win this one. Christianity has already won. Yeah, yeah.
So I was encouraged by that, but I'm curious what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I got a lot, but one of the things that's top of mind is it kind of feels like almost every week I talk to somebody else at the table who is saying like, I just have this like haunting fear or anxiety around the reality that it feels like in using AI because, I have to either because if I don't, they'll hire somebody else who will. But there's this like nagging fear that like you're training up your replacement and that this is not a long-term kind of solution. And, as a pastor, I respond to those things by talking about, God's faithfulness to provide and how he is sovereign. Like this is not it's not like God is unaware of these kinds of things. And also we're not guaranteed, comfort, especially in the way that, upper middle class American might define comfort. And so it's a mix of good and bad news, right?
Yeah.
But I think something that Mike said that is really encouraging and interesting to me, which is, he was saying that like embodied, and I think this actually might have been after we hit record, we stopped recording, come to think of it.
We've got to stop doing that.
I know.
The best conversations once we hit stop.
It might be, but my memory is fuzzy because we talked about it a lot. But anyway, he was saying that like going forward, the most important and valuable and competitive vocational skill is going to be the embodied persuasion.
Yes.
And one, that's just like personally encouraging because I'm a pastor and I do it every Sunday morning. Right. So I'm
Your
like,
job is safe.
I'm like, and also, even before then, one of the weird realities of pastoring a church that is like the vast majority are like software engineers and just general, like engineers in general, is that like my job is definitely not go away, but I might not be able to like a church may not be able to afford me if some of this does happen. Right. So like my skill sets will always be needed. But man, if people don't have jobs, it's going to be really hard to give to a church and therefore pay a pastor's salary. So like there's all these like knock-on effects and kind of concentric circles of impact that are going to spiral out from there that we just don't have. Like you can't predict because it's in a complex economy. All that said, like what was interesting to me about that point that Mike made was it reminded me of I don't even remember who was it that said this, but somebody who's probably a podcast on AI and looking at like, okay, how do we anticipate this economically and in terms of jobs? And their advice was to really pursue jobs that are tied to people and place, or at least one of the two. And I'm on the one hand, I'm like, okay, wow, that actually explains some of the anxiety around AI because it's really white collar jobs that all blue collar jobs are tied to people in place, right? Kind of just by their nature. So white collar jobs experiencing like the anxiety of AI is because those are the ones that are being threatened in ways that it was the exact opposite for the Industrial Revolution, right? So that's a fascinating kind of galaxy brain moment. But also, it is encouraging because it makes you wonder if there's going to be a snapback in terms of like what we value in vocation and how we steward that. Like it's going to force a reckoning in a lot of ways around the value that we have for convenience and efficiency right now, that embodiment and place and people and having a place you can go to every week for a hug. I don't know how we continue down this trajectory and that not be a recovered value, because it'll either be our experience will either just continue to suck epically online, or we won't even have the option of doing jobs online and remote, and it will force us to recover that. So like either way, there's a sense that that's kind of encouraging in a weird way. In the long term, especially short term, man, it could still get really. We're in for some serious disruption over the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, we're seeing the impact of smartphones and social media leading to a serious degradation of basic social skills and also energy and capacity for relationships and conflict within relationships.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, it makes me think back about how when we first regathered after the pandemic, there was somebody at the table who said, like, we got to teach people how to people again.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and that is, I mean, the church isn't going to just be needed for the epistemological stewardship. It's also going to be absolutely essential for the rehumanization of everything that ends up getting lost when we outsource truth, goodness, and beauty to an artificial intelligence.
Yeah. What if the most human place you experience is Sunday morning at your church?
Come on. Now that's what I'm talking about.
Not what if. That is probably the most human place a human can experience, or at least it should be, and that should be encouraging for us to think about, hey, the church is God's plan A, there is no plan B, as we've said over and over again.
And maybe, just maybe, we might actually start to believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome, man.
Brad, it's been good talking again.
Likewise. Yeah, let's do it again next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, text it to a friend. Please take a minute and rate this podcast. Leaving a review helps other people find us and connect. You can send us questions or feedback by emailing us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com. Thank you.